A black bear was about to be euthanized and begged this man. What happened next brought everyone to tears. The late autumn wind swept through the trees of Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, rustling leaves already tinged with frost. Branches creaked overhead like old bones, and somewhere in the distance, a raven called out once before falling silent. Dr. Elaine Carter stood just outside the infirmary, arms folded, her breath fogging in the cold air as she stared at the massive enclosure where Bruno, the grizzly bear who had once been the heart of the sanctuary, now lay unmoving in a patch of thinning grass. For nearly 3 weeks, the 900-pound bear had wasted away before their eyes. Once a lumbering giant with eyes full of quiet power, Bruno now barely lifted his head. His thick brown fur was dull and patchy, his breath shallow and ragged. Elaine had tried everything, every possible diagnosis, every treatment, every hopeful whisper of an experimental option. Nothing had worked. The blood work came back clean, the scans showed nothing conclusive. It was like something invisible was draining the life from him, and she couldn't stop it. It was killing her inside. A bear like Bruno didn't just belong to the sanctuary, he was the sanctuary. Rescued from an illegal roadside circus 12 years earlier, he had come in with infected paws and terror in his eyes. Elaine still remembered how long it had taken to gain his trust, how he'd eventually learned to stand in calm confidence before visitors, a symbol of survival and strength. Now he was fading, and she could do nothing but watch. She turned at the sound of footsteps on gravel. It was Maya, one of the interns. "Dr. Carter," she said quietly, "Walter's here with Max." Elaine's brow furrowed in surprise. Walter? He hadn't visited in weeks. She glanced past Maya to see the familiar old man making his way up the path with a slow, deliberate gait. His tall German shepherd, Max, though graying around the muzzle, still moved with the grace of a working dog, alert, watchful, and grounded. "I thought he only came on weekends," Elaine murmured, wiping her hands on her coat as she walked to meet him. "He heard about Bruno," Maya said softly. "Said he had a feeling." Walter nodded in greeting as she approached. "Afternoon, document." His voice was raspy but warm. Max wagged his tail once, eyes flicking between the two humans before settling on the enclosure. "Bruno's not doing well," Elaine said, her voice low. "We've tried everything. If there's no change by tomorrow morning..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Walter nodded slowly, his eyes shadowed. Then, without another word, he looked down at Max. "Go on, boy," he said gently. Max took a step forward. Elaine stiffened. "Walter, he can't go in." "He won't." Walter assured her, "Just trust him." Max padded toward the chain-link fence that bordered Bruno's enclosure. The air was still. Even the trees seemed to quiet. Inside the enclosure, Bruno didn't move. He hadn't stirred all morning. Max reached the fence, sat down, and tilted his head. Then, in a voice no louder than a sigh, he let out a single soft bark. Bruno's ears twitched. Elaine blinked. Then, slowly, achingly slowly, the bear's massive head lifted from the ground. His eyes opened, bloodshot and dull, but they focused right on Max. It was only for a second, a flicker of awareness, but it was something. Something new. Max lowered himself to the ground, curling up beside the fence as if this were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't bark again. He didn't whine. He simply stayed there, eyes half closed, breathing calmly. On the other side of the fence, Bruno let out a low, rattling breath and shifted, dragging himself a few inches closer before resting his chin on the ground again. "Oh my God," Maya whispered from behind. Elaine didn't speak, her throat had gone dry. For days, Bruno hadn't responded to food, noise, or touch, not even to the scent of fresh salmon. But now, at the sound of one soft bark from a dog he'd never met, something had awakened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't miraculous. But it was real. Elaine stepped forward, eyes locked on Bruno's form. "Maya," she said, "push the euthanasia, not tomorrow, not yet." Maya nodded, already pulling out her phone. Walter walked up beside Elaine, watching his dog and the bear in silence. "Max always knew things," he said after a moment. When people were trapped under rubble, he could find them without a sound. But it wasn't just scent. It was something deeper. "I've seen him lie next to kids in trauma, old folks in pain. He doesn't fix them, not exactly. He just lets them know they're not alone." Elaine swallowed hard. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, "but I'm not ignoring it. I'll rerun the test tonight, maybe we missed something." Walter gave a slow nod, and together they stood, watching the two animals, one aged but steady, the other a fading giant who had just, for the first time in days, chosen to lift his head. That night, the sanctuary stayed unusually quiet. Elaine barely slept. The new blood samples she took showed the same irregularities she'd seen before, but now she requested a more detailed toxin screen. Something nagged at her. Bruno's symptoms were inconsistent with disease. The sudden change today didn't fit any known pattern. But still, what if this wasn't illness at all? What if something darker was at work? The following morning, Bruno was still alive. Not only that, he was slightly improved. He'd shifted positions again during the night. When Elaine arrived just after dawn, she found Max already lying by the fence, tail thumping gently as Bruno blinked at the rising sun. Visitors began arriving shortly after, drawn by word of the bear's condition. Many paused when they saw Max quietly lying there as if guarding something sacred. Elaine didn't explain what was happening, not yet. She needed answers first. But deep down, a fragile hope had begun to stir. Walter came by again that afternoon, bringing Max some cooked chicken and sitting quietly on a bench nearby. He said nothing as Bruno let out a soft huff and inched even closer to the fence. One massive paw stretched forward as if reaching, not to grasp, but simply to be near. Word spread among the staff. The bear was reacting slowly, yes, but meaningfully. Elaine felt it in her chest, the subtle shift from despair to wonder. Something real was happening here. By evening, the toxicology lab called back with preliminary results. The voice on the phone was urgent. "We found something," the technician said. "Trace levels of thallium. It's a heavy metal toxin, rare, not easy to detect in small amounts, but we're seeing enough to explain the symptoms." Elaine's heart stopped. Poison. Someone had poisoned Bruno. Her eyes snapped to the enclosure, to the massive bear now breathing steadily, his eyes on the dog by the fence. Rage, cold and focused, welled in her chest. Someone had tried to kill this animal. And the only reason he might live was because of Max. Because a dog had come and reminded a dying bear that he wasn't alone. Rain fell in a fine mist the next morning, soaking the pine trees and softening the dirt trails that wound through Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary. Dr. Elaine Carter stood in her office, the lab report still clutched in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind of disbelief, fury, and dawning clarity. Thallium, she'd barely heard of the compound outside of textbooks in obscure toxicology case studies. A tasteless, odorless metal, nearly impossible to detect in low doses and absolutely lethal over time. The symptoms matched Bruno's neurological deterioration, weakness, unresponsiveness. No wonder the standard tests had failed to catch it. She gripped the edge of her desk, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Someone had poisoned Bruno, not by accident, not carelessly. This was deliberate, planned, executed. And for the first time in weeks, the path ahead was terrifyingly clear. "You saved his life, old boy," she muttered, glancing out the rain-specked window where Max lay under a tree, water soaking his thick fur, utterly unfazed. The dog's amber eyes remained fixed on Bruno's enclosure, calm and watchful. Elaine stepped away from her desk and called in Maya and two of the other senior staff members. She handed them copies of the lab report, watching their faces pale as they read the words, and explained her suspicions in a quiet, firm voice. "This wasn't nature," she said. "It wasn't bad luck. Someone wanted him gone." The team exchanged uneasy glances. "But why?" Maya asked. "Why target Bruno?" Elaine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the drawer of her desk and pulled out a file marked Personnel/Volunteers. She flipped through it until she found the name that had been tugging at her mind since last night, Jason Blackwood. Jason had arrived at the sanctuary 6 weeks earlier, just before Bruno began showing symptoms. He'd claimed to be a zoology student from Montana State, eager to help with large animal care. His resume had looked legitimate, polite, eager, quiet, but not in a way that raised red flags. Elaine had assigned him to minor duties, feeding, cleaning, simple animal checks. Nothing serious, nothing close to Bruno. But something about his timing, his quiet movements, and the way he disappeared a week ago now made her skin crawl. "I want to run his background again," she said. "Full check. School, references, anything we missed. If this ties back to him, we need to report it immediately." That afternoon, with the rain still falling, Elaine walked the perimeter of Bruno's enclosure, noting every detail. Bruno had begun to eat again, just small bites, and he'd even tried to stand briefly before collapsing back down, exhausted but alive. Max had barely left his side. Walter arrived just as Elaine finished her circuit, a faint frown beneath his thick gray beard. "You heard," he said softly. Elaine nodded. "Thallium. Someone meant for him to die slowly, quietly, without suspicion." Walter sat beside her on the observation bench. "You think it was that kid?" He hesitated. "If not him, then someone who used him or who got him in here. But yes, I think Jason's involved." Walter said nothing for a long time. Then he reached down and patted Max's side. He felt something. "That first day I saw it in his posture." He walked right to the fence like he knew Bruno needed help, not medicine, just company. Elaine looked at Max, curled in the wet grass like a sentry. "I didn't believe in things like that," she admitted, but now, she trailed off. The dog raised his head, ears flicking, as Bruno let out a soft grunt. Then he relaxed again, content just to stay near. 2 days later, the full report on Jason came in, and it was damning. There was no enrollment record at Montana State. His listed address belonged to a storage unit in Montana. The references were fabricated. Elaine stared at the file in stunned silence. She handed it to Walter without a word. "So who is he?" Walter asked. Elaine's jaw tightened. "I think I know. I remember the name Blackwood. Andrew Blackwood. Walter's eyes widened. The developer? Elaine nodded. He's been trying to buy the land for years. Wants to turn this place into a private resort complex. We fought off 2 offers already. He's ruthless. Uses proxy buyers, false companies. If he couldn't buy us out, maybe he thought he could break us by killing Bruno. Walter finished grimly. Elaine's voice dropped. Bruno is our anchor, our symbol. Without him, the public interest dies, donations die, we fold. The land goes up for sale. Convenient, isn't it? She stood abruptly. I'm going to the authorities. This can't stay in-house anymore. The days that followed were a blur of statements, meetings with investigators, and rising tension. Jason Blackwood had fled, but he left behind enough digital breadcrumbs, fake ID scans and email addresses linked to a known shell company of his father's, to confirm his connection. The news broke nationwide within hours. Beloved grizzly poisoned in sanctuary sabotage plot. Elaine braced for backlash. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The sanctuary's phone lines lit up with support. Donations poured in, messages from across the country, from children who'd visited Bruno on school trips, from elderly couples who remembered him as a cub, from wildlife lovers moved by the story of a dying bear and the dog who wouldn't leave his side. The story struck a chord. Max, who had always seemed comfortable in the shadows, became an unexpected icon. Photos of him lying beside the fence were shared on social media thousands of times. News crews requested interviews. Elaine declined most. She had no interest in spectacle, but one afternoon, when a small local station asked to film Max and Bruno together for a conservation feature, she agreed on the condition that Walter speak for all of them. Standing before the camera in his old flannel coat, Walter kept his words simple. Max is a working dog, he said. He's always helped people, but animals feel things too. They know when someone's hurting. When Bruno was at his lowest, Max didn't try to fix him. He just laid down and said, "You're not alone." Sometimes that's all any of us need. The clip aired that evening and went viral overnight. By the week's end, national outlets were covering the story, Dog Saves Dying Bear, Interspecies Miracle at Wildlife Sanctuary. A bond beyond words? But behind the headlines, real change was beginning. A new wave of funding allowed Elaine to upgrade their veterinary equipment, expand staff, and secure tighter security around the sanctuary. More importantly, the sanctuary's legal team filed for protective status, permanent conservation designation, making it nearly impossible for any corporate entity to buy the land, no matter how many shell companies they used. Bruno, meanwhile, continued to improve. His appetite returned, his movements grew stronger. By the end of the second week, he could stand unaided for several minutes, sniff the air, and even bat at enrichment toys with a sluggish but undeniable energy of recovery. Max remained his constant shadow. Elaine watched them one quiet evening as dusk fell, Bruno leaning against a tree trunk inside the enclosure. Max pressed against the fence, only a few feet away. No barking, no fanfare, just a mutual presence. Elaine thought about all the ways she had tried to save Bruno: science, medicine, precision. And yet, it was empathy that had broken through. A dog's intuition, a stranger's warmth. She made a note to test the rest of the animal enclosures for any trace of thallium. Thankfully, all came back clean. Jason had focused on Bruno alone, one target, one symbol. Elaine knew they'd likely never catch him. He was out there, hiding behind lawyers and connections. But it didn't matter. He'd failed. Bruno was alive, and because of that, so was the sanctuary. She left the office late that night, the air crisp and clean. As she passed the enclosure, she saw Bruno lift his head, his eyes following her. She paused behind her, and Max stood up and padded to her side. "Thank you," she whispered to them both, unsure who she meant more. In truth, it didn't matter. The snow came early that year, draping Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary in a soft white hush that seemed to muffle the chaos of the outside world. It dusted the pine needles and settled over the animal enclosures, leaving only the faintest tracks behind. Max's careful steps as he padded toward Bruno's area, his breath fogging in the air. Walter followed behind slowly, his knees aching a little more each morning, but he wouldn't dream of skipping the visit. Every day, without fail, Max made his rounds to Bruno's fence line, stopping only to check the same spots as if making sure his big friend was still there. Bruno, though still recovering, had grown stronger by the day. His coat had regained its rich, healthy sheen. He stood now with more ease, lumbered around the enclosure's edge during feeding, and often waited near the fence when he sensed Max's approach. It was never dramatic, never loud, just a silent exchange of presence. They didn't need noise. They had each other, and now, the whole world was watching. Ever since the news of Bruno's poisoning and Max's role in saving him had broken, Pine Ridge had changed. The sleepy sanctuary, once overlooked by the world, was now alive with attention, flooded by donations, emails, volunteer applications, and letters from children who drew crayon pictures of bears and dogs in hearts. In between, the sanctuary staff had nearly doubled with more qualified hands than ever before. New fencing was installed, the veterinary lab got an upgrade, and Elaine had even hired a full-time communications coordinator just to handle the volume of interest. It was overwhelming but good, healing, even. But what truly shocked Elaine was how people seemed to connect to the story, not just the animals. It wasn't just a bear. It wasn't just a dog. It was a bond, a message, something quiet and sacred that resonated in a way no press release or campaign ever could. It was something real, and that perhaps is what frightened their enemies most. Andrew Blackwood's legal team had gone on the offensive as soon as the poisoning evidence went public. They denied involvement, claimed Jason wasn't connected, and called the allegations baseless, even as investigators tied the forged documents, hidden emails, and sanctuary surveillance footage directly to Jason's movements. But in the court of public opinion, Blackwood had already lost. His development project, the grand vision of a luxury mountain resort, collapsed under the weight of protest. Environmental groups, media personalities, and schoolchildren with hand-painted signs who showed up at local council meetings demanding protection for Pine Ridge. Politicians took notice. Within a month, the sanctuary's land was placed under emergency review for federal conservation status. Elaine had barely slept in those weeks, but every sleepless night was worth it when she stood in front of the town hall, Max at her side, and watched the vote pass with near-unanimous support. "They can't take us now," she said softly to Walter as they walked back to the truck. "They'll try again, I'm sure, but not today. Not anymore." Meanwhile, Bruno's recovery reached a turning point. A week after the snow began to fall, he climbed the sloped ridge at the back of his enclosure, a height he hadn't attempted since his illness. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes, nose raised into the wind, his breath rising in soft white clouds as he scanned the forest. Max, watching from below, barked once. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent, just a greeting. Bruno looked down, a low huff rumbled in his chest, and he slowly made his way down, lumbering but sure. Elaine stood watching from the viewing area, her heart full. "He wants out," she said to Walter. "Back to the wild?" Walter asked. Elaine nodded. "He's strong enough. The toxicology is clear, no lingering effects. He's pacing more, climbing, exploring. He's getting restless. I think he's ready." Walter didn't answer immediately. He looked at Max, who lay by the fence as if understanding the weight of the conversation. "It's time, then," he said finally. "Let him go while he still knows the forest, before he forgets what freedom feels like." Preparations began the same day. The sanctuary had a protocol for releasing rehabilitated animals into controlled wild zones, and Bruno's territory had been studied, mapped, and protected since the day he arrived years earlier. But this was different. Bruno wasn't just any animal. He was the soul of the sanctuary, the beating heart that had survived cruelty, illness, and human betrayal. Letting him go felt like releasing a piece of their own story into the wild. On the day of the release, the staff gathered before dawn. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the sky was clear. Elaine stood by the gate with Walter and Max, her hand resting on the latch. Bruno was already near the entrance, sensing change. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't aggressive. He was calm, even dignified, as if he knew this was the next step. The gate creaked open slowly. Bruno stepped forward, then paused. He looked at Elaine, then at Max. The dog stood, ears forward, tail still, and took a single step closer. Bruno gave a soft, guttural chuff, then he turned and walked into the trees, one massive paw print at a time, leaving the sanctuary behind. No one spoke for several moments, only the sound of wind through branches and the soft crunch of melting snow. Elaine exhaled slowly. "He's really gone." Walter put a hand on her shoulder. "He's not gone, just free." Weeks passed. The sanctuary continued to thrive. The story of Bruno and Max was adapted into a children's book. A documentary crew began filming segments with the staff and animals, highlighting the sanctuary's mission and the emotional lives of the creatures it protected. Elaine found herself reflecting more often on connection, trust, the strange web of empathy that existed across species, across silence. Max remained the same, steady, watchful, present. Though Bruno was gone, Max still walked the perimeter of the enclosure each morning, stopping in his usual spot, lying down for a while as if keeping a space warm in case an old friend returned. Winter deepened, then one morning, near the end of February, a staff member came running to Elaine's office. "You need to come outside," she said, out of breath. Elaine followed quickly, heart pounding with a sudden and inexplicable hope. Walter and Max were already at the edge of the forest trail just beyond the sanctuary fence. Max stood alert, tail held still, and there, beyond the treeline, half shrouded by snow and morning mist, stood Bruno, taller, stronger, and somehow even larger than before. He raised his head and stared directly at Max. The two animals held their gaze for what felt like eternity. Then Bruno rose up on his hind legs, not in warning, not in fear, but in a slow, majestic stretch, lifting himself tall as if in salute. Max didn't move. He simply stood there, ears twitching, eyes shining. Bruno dropped back down, turned, and vanished into the trees. Elaine blinked away tears. Around her, no one spoke. The moment was too large for words. That evening, she wrote in her journal, something she hadn't done in years: "There are bonds we will never fully understand. Some formed in silence, some across fences, some between animals who have every reason to fear each other but choose connection instead. Bruno is wild again, but he left us a gift, proof that compassion is not a human trait. It is a living force, and sometimes it walks on four paws and knows when to lie quietly beside a dying friend. Spring returns slowly to Pine Ridge, with melting snow giving way to damp earth and new green growth. Streams swelled with meltwater, and songbirds return to the trees, their calls echoing across the hills in tones of renewal. For the first time in months, the sanctuary felt at peace. The air was no longer heavy with grief or fear. It was vibrant again, pulsing with the quiet rhythm of life. Elaine Carter stood at the sanctuary gate one morning, watching a group of schoolchildren follow a guide down the path toward the fox enclosure. Their laughter was light and curious, full of wonder. She remembered when the sanctuary had nearly fallen silent, when Bruno had lain motionless and death hovered like a fog over them all. Now, the space that once held despair was filled with voices, discovery, and hope. The past few months had transformed Pine Ridge. Thanks to the influx of donations and national attention, the sanctuary had upgraded nearly every facility: new enclosures, a fully equipped veterinary wing, and interactive exhibits that taught children about animal emotions, trauma, and healing. There was even a new mural on the main education hall, Max and Bruno, painted side by side. The great grizzly resting his head beside the German shepherd, both eyes full of calm understanding. Elaine had approved it herself. She stood by it often, watching visitors stare in quiet reverence. It wasn't just a tribute. It was a reminder of what they stood for: healing, trust, wildness, and compassion coexisting in ways few understood. Max had become a legend. Children asked for him by name. Journalists wanted interviews. Artists sent in portraits. But Max didn't care for fame. He still woke at dawn, stretched in that slow, deliberate way only older dogs do, and waited patiently for Walter to finish his coffee. Before beginning their daily walk, they stopped by Bruno's old enclosure. Every morning, though the gate was now left open, symbolic of his return to freedom, Max always paused, sat by the familiar spot in the grass, and watched the tree line. He never barked, never whimpered, just waited. Walter didn't say much either, but sometimes, when the wind shifted and the air carried the scent of pine and bare musk, he'd smile slightly and pat Max's head. "He remembers," he'd whisper. "So do we." Elaine often joined them, standing silently beside man and dog, drawn to the simplicity of the ritual. She knew Bruno wouldn't come every day, but she also knew he hadn't forgotten. That was the truth of wild creatures: they didn't dwell, but they remembered. Late one June morning, the sanctuary received an unexpected letter. It arrived by hand, delivered not by post but by a ranger from the State Wildlife Service. The envelope was thick, embossed with the seal of the Department of the Interior. Inside was a formal declaration: Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary had been granted permanent federal conservation status. No development, no sales, no interference. The land would be protected for generations to come. Elaine read the letter 3 times before she believed it. Her hands trembled as she passed it to Walter. "It's over," she said. "We're safe." He took a long breath and nodded. "We earned it." Max wagged his tail once as if in agreement, before turning and trotting toward the enclosure again, like he knew something was coming. The news spread fast. Journalists returned, and the sanctuary threw a modest celebration, inviting the community, the donors, and the schoolchildren who'd sent letters in defense of Bruno and Max. But the real celebration came days later when a dark shape emerged from the trees near twilight. Elaine was the first to see him. She had just finished her final rounds and was heading back to the main lodge when something made her turn, a shift in the wind, a flicker of movement between the trunks, and there he was, Bruno, larger than she remembered, muscular, confident, no longer the slow, sluggish bear of months past. He moved with purpose, his massive head lifted, dark eyes calm. Max was already at the edge of the enclosure. He had stopped mid-step, ears pricked forward, body completely still. The two locked eyes. The others arrived slowly, Walter, Maya, a few staffers, but no one spoke. They simply watched. Bruno approached the fence line and stopped just outside the open gate, his breath rising in slow puffs. Max didn't move, not even when Bruno took a step forward and let out a soft, guttural chuff, the same sound he'd made that first day Max had come to him. Max stepped forward and sat down. For a long moment they stayed that way, just sitting, just being. Elaine felt tears sting her eyes, the weight of everything, the poisoning, the fight to survive, the threats against their land, the miracle of recovery. It all poured into that one silent exchange. Bruno turned then, not away, but around, pacing slowly through the open gate and into the empty enclosure. He circled once, his movements deliberate, then walked to the tree at the center, the same one he'd leaned against during his weakest days, and brushed his massive body against the trunk. A mark, a memory, a message. Then, without looking back, he exited the enclosure again and vanished into the woods. Elaine let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He came home, she whispered. Walter nodded beside her. Just to say goodbye. Max remained sitting for several more minutes before he rose, stretched, and returned to Walter's side. The forest quieted, but something lingered in the air, not sadness, not loss, but gratitude. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm of peace and purpose. The sanctuary leaned into its newfound status, not as a zoo, but as a refuge, a story, a living lesson in resilience. Max, ever present, became the ambassador of that story. Children read his book in school, tourists came not just to see animals but to feel something deeper, connection. Elaine found herself invited to conferences, asked to speak about animal trauma, about the power of interspecies empathy. She declined most. Her place was here, with them, with Max, with the trees that still whispered Bruno's name in the wind. Then, 1 year to the day after Bruno's release, Walter and Max made their annual walk. It was early morning. Mist clung to the undergrowth. Walter's steps were slower now. Max's muzzle was whiter, but their spirits were the same. They reached the open enclosure just as the sun broke the horizon. Max walked to the same spot as always and lay down. Walter sat on the bench, and from the trees, a shape appeared, Bruno, older, wiser, still immense. He came no closer than before. He didn't need to. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. Max lifted his head, no bark, no movement, just recognition, a soft exhale. Bruno stood on his hind legs as he had the year before, his body rising tall into the morning light. Then he turned and disappeared once more. That night, Elaine wrote her final entry about them. Max and Bruno taught us something the world had forgotten, that empathy doesn't require language, that healing begins with presence, that the wild and the tame are not enemies, they are brothers. Sometimes they are quiet protectors, and when one lies dying in silence, sometimes the other comes, not with force, but with stillness, not with noise, but with love. She closed the notebook and looked out at the forest beyond. Somewhere out there, a bear lived wild and free, and back here, an old dog waited patiently, still believing in things most humans had forgotten. Every year they met, and every year the world was made a little kinder because of it. Summer returned to Pine Ridge with a quiet gentleness, not in sudden bursts of color, but in gradual awakenings. The murmur of brooks unfrozen, the trembling green tips on pine branches, the way the light lingered a little longer each evening. The sanctuary thrived, pulsing with life, as though the land itself remembered the bear who had once lain dying beneath its trees and the dog who refused to leave his side. Bruno was gone now, deep into the wild where humans did not walk, but his presence never truly left. His paw prints had long since faded from the trails, but his spirit had embedded itself in the rhythm of the place. Max, aging steadily but holding strong, still walked those same paths every morning with Walter, his steps slower but deliberate, each one purposeful. They stopped often now, not just at Bruno's old enclosure, still left open, still sacred, but at the newer spaces built in the bear's honor, the children's garden carved in the shape of a paw print, the observation deck shaped like a ridge, and the stone marker that read, "Here, a bear was saved, not by medicine, but by a friend." Elaine often visited the marker, especially at dusk, when the forest softened and the wind carried whispers through the trees. She'd kneel by the stone, fingers brushing the engraved letters, her thoughts quiet and reflective. The sanctuary was no longer simply a place to house animals, it had become something larger, a symbol, a story, a movement. Bruno and Max had ignited something in people, a sense of wonder and responsibility. Schools incorporated their tale into ethics classes, artists painted murals on city buildings, and a group of former corporate lawyers even formed a non-profit to protect endangered sanctuaries, calling themselves the Bruno Pact. But time moved forward even for legends. One cool autumn morning, Max didn't rise with his usual energy. Walter, now more hunched than ever, noticed the difference immediately. Max's tail wagged, but slowly. His breath was shallow, his limbs heavy. Walter sat beside him in silence, his coffee going cold on the porch. He didn't rush the moment, he just stayed there, fingers tracing the old leather of Max's collar, the one he'd worn since his rescue days, since before Bruno, before the sanctuary became a beacon. Elaine came quickly when Walter called. She examined Max gently, her hands kind, her face tight with the knowledge she had dreaded. He wasn't in pain, just tired, very, very tired, the kind of tired you don't wake up from. That night, Max lay in front of the fireplace in Elaine's office, surrounded by quiet company, no machines, no noise. Just Walter's steady breath, Elaine's soft humming, and the scent of pine drifting through the window. He passed in his sleep, curled like he always had, his head resting on his paws. Elaine wept quietly. Walter didn't speak, but the look in his eyes held decades of gratitude for a dog who had saved not just a bear, but something in all of them. The news of Max's passing spread across the country in a single day. Tributes came in waves, letters, videos, donations in his name. A poem written by a fourth-grade class in Oregon was published in 3 national newspapers. One line stood out above the rest, "He barked just once, and it saved a life." At Pine Ridge, the sanctuary prepared a quiet farewell, no spectacle, just the way Max would have wanted. They held it near the ridge where Bruno had been released, the same place where Bruno had returned each year. Staff and locals gathered, some knelt, others stood in silence. Walter placed Max's collar on the stone marker beside Bruno's name. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. Elaine looked at the crowd and found her voice. "Max didn't just save Bruno," she said. He reminded us that stillness can heal, that presence matters. He didn't ask to be a hero, he just showed up every single day. The forest was quiet after that, as if even the trees were mourning, not with sorrow, but with reverence. That winter was the longest yet. Snow fell in sheets, the sanctuary closed to the public for repairs and rest. Elaine took time to herself, sorting through photos, journals, and sketches. She found an old picture taken the day after Bruno first stirred beside the fence, Max curled up against the chain link, Bruno's eyes just barely open. Looking back, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was everything. She framed it and hung it above her desk. As spring broke again, Walter still came to the sanctuary, though slower now, leaning on a carved walking stick a volunteer had made for him. He no longer walked the full perimeter, but he always visited the marker, always sat on the bench beneath the pines, always looked to the trees. Elaine often joined him. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not, but every once in a while, just as they sat in the fading gold of evening, the forest gave something back, a rustle, a low huff, a massive shadow between the trunks. They never tried to approach, they never called out. They simply watched, and each time, Bruno came no closer than the edge, but he looked. He always looked. Years passed. Children who had once visited as students returned as volunteers. The sanctuary added new animals, each with their own stories, but Bruno and Max's remained the heart of it all. A statue was erected, not grand or polished, but earthy, real. It showed Max lying down, ears perked, and Bruno sitting beside him, not aggressive, not caged, just present. Visitors touched it gently as they passed, some leaving flowers, others just their thoughts. One little boy asked his mother why the bear wasn't roaring. The mother smiled. Because he was never angry, she said. He was just waiting for someone to see him. On the 10th anniversary of Bruno's recovery, the sanctuary held a gathering. People came from across the country. Walter was there, thinner now, his hair white as snow, but his voice still strong. Elaine stood beside him, gray at her temples, wisdom in her eyes. The two stood before the crowd, and Walter spoke for the first time in years. "I don't believe in coincidences," he said, voice gravel and wind. Max knew Bruno was hurting before anyone else did, and Bruno, well, he knew what Max had given him. That's why he came back every year, to say thank you. We didn't just witness a miracle, we were part of it, and it changed everything. The crowd stood in silence as the forest stirred behind them. No one saw him at first. Then a child pointed. There, between the trees, a shape emerged, older now, but unmistakable. Bruno, grizzled and massive. A living monument. He paused at the edge of the tree line, eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Walter. Then, slowly, reverently, he stood on his hind legs one final time. The crowd held their breath, and then he dropped down, turned, and disappeared into the forest forever. Walter lowered his head. "Goodbye, old friend," he whispered. That night, Elaine sat by the fire with a new journal in her lap. She opened to the first page and wrote, "Some stories never end, they echo beyond fences, beyond lifespans, beyond even memory. Bruno is free, Max rests beneath the pines, but their bond remains etched in this land, in the hearts of all who remember. And every time the wind rustles through the trees, we hear it again, the bark that saved a bear."